ancient appearance. I'll read from John chapter 20, verse 30 and 31. And many other signs truly did Jesus in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book. But these are written that ye might believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing ye might have life through his name. It's a bit hilarious when you think of it, that the New Testament, according to researchers and certainly according to just people reading a Bible, like if you've got a good study Bible, you can even see at the back of it that dating for when the New Testament was written. So it was written somewhere like in the 1st century AD, not like 3,000 or 4,000 years ago, 5,000 years ago or so. The reason why I think that's a little hilarious is because by that time there were so many wars, and you can get a picture of how crazy the world would have been for different civilizations in different lands at the time when the New Testament was being put together, was being written. You can get an idea for what the world would have been like for them when you think of your own time now, with all the news on the radio and online, reading websites and from television and now YouTube, because a lot of people get their news on YouTube as well, or other such social media type sites, of the many wars going on largely right now in the Middle East, but this is just going to be spreading all over. And when you see the atrocities being committed by people who are presented in the news as fighting for justice and equality and fairness, and they, it turns out, are the ones who are actually bringing the aggression to other people who just want to live peacefully. So what that's telling you is that people are in dangerous environments when it comes to war. So the world is, like they say, going to hell in a handbasket. So back then, when the New Testament was being written, this is the kind of world you're dealing with. The same would have gone for the Torah as well. That God would have given supposedly his book of his great message for mankind in a time when the world is being destroyed, when sometimes there's freedom of speech issues and people are being subjugated, not able to speak up freely, and books are sometimes confiscated and burned. Some views are outlawed. So this is the kind of world that God dropped his book in, both Old and New Testament. So now you move to the New Testament times, and he has a master plan to bring Jesus, who, like I titled this, had ancient appearances. And he realizes, I better come and do a master work on Calvary because earth is just getting way out of control. And the book is put together round about the time when he came, or shortly thereafter. And it doesn't really change anything in the world. Like, there's still wars going on. Wars linked to those ancient times as well. But it really is funny that it said the things that he did were so much that the world could not contain all the books that would be written, if all these things he did, these miracles, were written. So they only wrote what they were able to write of the many things he did. So understand what's going on there in that verse or verses, John 20, verse 30 and 31, is that even though everything could not be written of him, they wrote as many important miracles about him and other teachings that they could in such a dangerous world. We often hear people talk about a golden age or a blissful age before sin came in and the world got turned upside down, and we all wish we could get to that kind of Edenic setting where there was no sin on earth, no fighting and wickedness. But notice that the prophecy in Genesis chapter 3 verse 15 says, and I will put enmity, so I'll put war, just like the wars you're having now and the wars at the time when the New Testament was put together. I'll put war between thee and the woman, and between thy seed and her seed. It shall bruise thy head, and thou shalt bruise his heel. So they're telling us, for the New Testament teachers, that Jesus made numerous appearances in ancient times. And they've got him all over the Old Testament, supposedly, of him appearing to people like Abraham, Daniel, and others. Why did they not write something like they wrote in the New Testament, that he showed up? Why did they not write something like they wrote in the New Testament, that he showed up? See, when he came in the New Testament, they made it very plain, very clear, that this is the one who was spoken of. But they didn't want to say that in the Old Testament times. Like after he showed up, for example, in Abraham's time, why didn't Abraham, or whoever was writing of Abraham, like they say, supposedly Moses, why didn't he write that the one that came to see Abraham when the three angels showed up was the one prophesied of in the garden in Genesis 3:15? But in the New Testament, it will say this was the one prophesied of by this or that prophet and so on. So it wants the link there and it wants clarity. So it spells it out and says this prophet said this prophet said that of him, and here he is. Why did Old Testament people who had a closer and stronger connection to God in sacrificial times when sacrifices were burning and going up before God, so they had a closer connection to him, to God, why didn't they mention that and be clear that this was Jesus who showed up here, that this was Jesus who showed up here, like Abraham, he showed up to me and to my wife Sarah? So the New Testament seems to be claiming things that the Old Testament does not claim, that the Old Testament does not claim. Someone has to be in the New Testament times looking back and making what seems to me to be very powerful claims that, as I have shown in this series, they're just not supported by what the people are saying in the Old Testament. But if you say this Christ made ancient appearances, I want you to note one thing. In all his ancient appearances, it was really the Bible people who talked about having met with him, or who actually met with him. So the New Testament people talked about the Old Testament meeting with him, but the Old Testament people didn't try to go back and talk about it like that. They just simply met with him, and the text will show that they met with him. Supposedly it was him, I mean. But it's Bible-based people in Old and New Testament who met with this Christ. You're not going to get somebody all the way in ancient China just having met with Jesus. You're not going to get someone in Persia having met with him. You're not going to get somebody someplace in ancient Ethiopia having met with him. They tell us now through all kinds of archaeological research that America, supposedly, so it could be true, was populated long, like ancient times ago, thousands of years ago. If that is true, you're sure not gonna find any story out there that seems credible, at least, or seems biblically acceptable, that somebody in North America somewhere met with Jesus. So ancient appearances by Jesus are only propped up, supported by Bible people. Only someone religiously minded that was in the Bible ever met with Jesus. It's like they say, if you're defining a word, you shouldn't really use that word to define itself. So to get a good description of what the word is about, try to describe the word with other words. But only Bible-based people talk about Jesus having shown up in ancient times, which then makes you not be able to really be mad at the other religions whose books talk about their gods because only their people saw those gods. Look in John chapter 1, verse 1, and I'll read maybe 2 or 3 other verses. In the beginning, John chapter 1, verse 1, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. This was used to teach that this was Jesus, that he is actually God, and he put on flesh and came here. Verse 4, in him was life, and the life was the light of men. Verse 9, that was the true light that lighteth every man that cometh into the world. So every man gets the light of revelation, and from a Torah point of view, the light of revelation that comes from God makes one wise, and Torah people are always teaching about God's light to make sure the people around them and the world at large know the light. And this is what Jesus came for, to show his light so that everyone would know. But when he showed up with all these ancient appearances in the Old Testament, only the Bible people knew. And they apparently had no wisdom from this light of Jesus' ancient appearances to go far enough to let them broadcast this message of light and wisdom to the rest of the world, so that all of the biblical appearances of Jesus, which have not been able to be verified by sources outside the Bible, all of these teachings that they give about his ancient appearances collapse on themselves in the Bible. They do not grow out like a tree of life, giving fruit and life to the rest of the world. Notice as well that if many things he did could not be written down because it would just be too much, then at least you have a miraculous Jesus, a healing Jesus. He loved to heal. He loved to work miracles like crazy. He doesn't seem to want to do that in the Old Testament. But the God of the Torah seems consistent. He starts off from the first book in Genesis, look, if you eat this, you're going to die. So, and he goes all throughout the Torah, warning people about his commandments and punishing them as well. Like he warned them in Eden and punished them by kicking them out, giving them death. And he keeps that consistency all the way to the end of the prophecies in Malachi, saying, if you guys don't straighten up there on earth, I'm going to send a curse upon the earth. And then even the New Testament seems to be reflecting that by saying God's going to bring some final end time judgment on the earth and so on. So the God of the Torah is consistent. The way he is from page 1 is just the way he is to the end. He just keeps doing it. He wants you to keep his commandment. If you don't, he's just going to rough you up and kick your butt. So why is Jesus so healing and so much of a miracle worker in the New Testament, but he's not that healing and a miracle worker in the Old Testament in his ancient appearances? But he says, what I see my Father do, I do. Well, that cannot be right. So here I'm showing again, in this audio-video commentary that you will not easily find in commentaries out there, that Jesus is inconsistent with his Father, even though he claimed, what I hear and see my Father say and do, that I do also. He's very inconsistent. So you can throw this whole like father, like son kind of thing when it comes to Jesus. Because in the New Testament, he's doing his own thing. When you read Genesis and you see them getting kicked out of the garden and you see other things develop in the Old Testament, you can tell later on in the Old Testament that this is the same kind of God. You kind of get the sense that this is the same God from Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and so on, that's there in Obadiah all the way up to Malachi. You get that sense. But when Jesus makes his appearance in the Old Testament, and then you see this character make an appearance in New Testament times, you can't quite tell that it's the same person. They're different. Because one heals, is on a miracle craze, a frenzy of miraculous displays of power. That just doesn't happen in the Old Testament. But look now, for the ancient appearances, something is even more strange. Because they wrote down many things about him when he showed up. But it seems to be only Bible-based people in the New Testament. But can anyone out there tell me why it is that other people did not write about this Jesus who made ancient appearances in the Old Testament? I was just reading this history book, and as I flipped through the table of contents, it's just a history book, the name doesn't really matter, and I thought to myself, they're talking here about the prehistoric period, definition, data, and methods, the origin of man, cultures and their dating, and so on, the Paleolithic period, Mesolithic period, Neolithic period, Chalcolithic period, Bronze Age, and so on. And then they give the different empires and cultures. Then they go on to early empires of Africa and Asia, Egypt, Mesopotamia, Sumer, Akkad, Babylonia, Assyria. And they move on some more. Syria, Damascus, Asia Minor, the Hittites, and the Lydians. And then they talked about Hellenistic monarchies. Like, did Jesus in his ancient appearances show up in these Paleolithic and later times? Because these were people who were living in these times. And according to this book, it is saying that man probably goes back to 1 million years or so. And some people put it farther than that. Did Jesus go all the way back to 1 million years and is showing up to man and earth? And by the way, if he was such a healer, he loved to heal. And they say he was the one who showed up to clothe Adam and Eve in the garden. When they heard the footsteps coming in the garden, they said that was Jesus. If he was such a consistently powerful healer and miracle worker in the New Testament, and he loved to heal, he made the lame walk, he healed the sick of all their diseases and so on. Adam and Eve had the most deadly illness that came upon them in their bodies, and also the first known or spoken of illness in the Bible. And it reminds me of the verse that says there's a sickness unto death. So this Jesus again is not consistent because he loves to heal every minute, heal, heal, heal. Even woman touching the hem of his garment and she's getting healed. Like the thing is just flowing out of him. He doesn't even have to pray for you or touch you. You can just touch him. It just comes out. He didn't even touch the woman himself with his hands. She touched the hem of his garment. But Jesus, apparently, for the New Testament believers, the Messianic teachers, touched the garment, which was the coats of skins that they say he was the one who gave it to them, Adam and Eve, to clothe them. He gave them the garment. And the woman touched, that's her doing, her effort, touched the hem of his garment, and the power that he had flowed through the clothes because the clothes was connected to him. But Jesus would have touched or handled the coats of skin and pass it unto them, and it does not heal them, Adam and Eve, from their deadly disease, the sickness, the disease of sin that still continues to plague the world today. Yet people continue to worship this Jesus, who was responsible for sin rolling down the ages to you and I, because he could have stopped it. Because he was the one with the power over sin. New Testament says he even has the power to judge in the end, that he is the one who will judge the quick and the dead. And he died for sin, so he has the power to do something about sin. Notice that even though the Father tried to get people to sacrifice to him for their sin, the New Testament Messianic believers teach that the sin was only rolled back. So the Father chose a method to deal with sin by animal sacrifices that couldn't really handle sin properly. But Jesus, when he stepped in to do his sacrifice, sin was rolled away at Calvary. So Jesus had the power in Eden and did not stop it. And you suffer today because of that in our world. But you still choose to give your undying devotion to this demigod while he watches you die of all the illnesses that come into your life, your family's life, your friends' lives, and so on, and the rest of the people in your societies, wherever you are. He watches them all die, and he does not heal them. The great physician. So he didn't heal Adam and Eve through the virtue that should have flowed out of him if he was consistent, like I talked about consistency before of the God of the Old Testament. What do you see him doing? He's always doing it till the end of the book, the Old Testament. So Jesus should have been doing that as well. So if he was consistently a healer, he would have healed Adam and Eve, and the virtue would have flowed out of him when he handed them the coats, the garments, the clothing. Like the woman who touched the hem of his garment was healed. This Jesus is not consistent because the New Testament is fake. So in his ancient appearances, did all these people from these different time periods and from these ancient empires, why did they not write about him? Because in the New Testament, they wrote what they knew of him. Why did these other empires and people, these cultures, not write about Jesus? Well, he didn't show up to them. And that's my problem. He's showing up only to the Bible-based people. In the Old Testament, he shows up to just the Hebrews or the pre-Israelites and the Israelites, apparently. And in the New Testament, he's only showing up to them again because he said, I came unto my own. But he doesn't want to show up to anyone else. But again, that is inconsistent because he should have been showing up in the Chinese Empire, Egyptian Empire, every other kind of empire in India, everywhere else you go. He should have been showing up to them all in Mesopotamia. Why? Because his book, the New Testament, says something very strikingly powerful that takes him down. It robs him of his credibility. Him down. It robs him of his credibility. And I'll close with that right here. I just read it to you. I'll read it again. John chapter 1 and verse 9. It says, that was the true light that lighteth every man that cometh into the world. Because it said he was the light. Verse 4, in him was life, So he watched Adam and Eve get sick unto death from eating the wrong food. When people got sick in the New Testament from wrong food, bad food, poisonous food, or whatever virus they picked up that let them be sick, he healed them, and the crowd was just thronging on him so much that he could hardly stop. One time they let on a man break up the roof to let a man down just to be healed. Like this guy, this master healer was just healing overtime, working overtime. People pressing on him, pushing on him all the time. He's healing left, right, and center to people who weren't even keeping the commandments in some cases. He's healing even Roman soldiers. So he's healing everybody. Even people who don't keep the commandments. The demonic of Gadara, he wasn't keeping no damn commandments, being over there with all kinds of demons. Because with the result of commandment keeping give him all those demons. Legion of them. So he does not show partiality in the New Testament, really, even though he might have tried, I don't give my stuff to dogs, but even so, he ended up still giving his stuff to anybody, whether you're Israelite or not, whether you're keeping the commandments properly or not. He just gives it out. To lesser sicknesses. People have foot problems, they have back problems, they have whatever, all the stuff that they didn't write down, as well as the stuff they wrote down. He healed them of fevers and so on. But Adam and Eve have the greatest sickness, where their death results in the death of all humanity, in whatever sense that sickness meant. So they always say it's a spiritual death. But the greatest, most powerful sickness would be the spiritual death, because out of it comes the physical death. And Jesus healed as a priority, the physical sicknesses that would lead to physical death in his New Testament times. But in his ancient appearance in the Garden of Eden, his first appearance, he does not heal the spiritual greater death that would lead to the death of all mankind. I would think that if you were Jesus and you're making your first appearance on earth in the Garden of Eden, you should kick that off with a bang. They will always know my first appearance was a badass appearance. Because when I showed up in Eden, I healed so powerfully that it reversed the future of the death of mankind from the death they got from eating of that tree. But Jesus doesn't do that. But Jesus doesn't do that. This master healing in Eden would stop and reverse the spiritual death that's starting to happen to them, and reverse and keep away the physical death that will come on them. And later, Adam and Eve died in the book of Adam. So does this Jesus still look good to you? Or does it look like there's a problem somewhere? But he is that light, and he was the light of men. And that was the true light which lighteth every man that cometh into the world. So all these other civilizations, in all these other kingdoms, before New Testament times and before the Hebrew Israelite times, before Abraham was even called, all these other cultures, all over the earth, on the eastern side of the world and over here in the west, as I mentioned earlier, they talk about North America for thousands of years. They got frozen up and then they thawed out, or whatever. All of these different cultures and time periods in history, from the, like I said, the Paleolithic that I mentioned earlier, they had people. And they have different ways to test with their archaeology and their dating methods and so on to prove that people were living in these times. And so if Jesus lights every man that cometh into the world, why did no man ever record, even just with some, and it would have to be a lot because it would be spectacular that he showed up, so they would have said something. Why did they not have rock inscriptions and other ways of writing down that Jesus showed up, or this strange weird being showed up from God way back then? Why? He only shows up to people in Bible lands. Yet he lighteth every man. So if he lights every man, that means he does not give his revelation based on New Testament teaching now. He does not give his revelation only to Bible people in Palestine. He gives his revelation, which is the light of God. He gives his revelation to every man, every place on the earth, in every time period that they lived, way before even Stone Age. Because every man means every man who lived even in Paleolithic times. If you are a Paleolithic person and you do not have a pen and paper, the wisdom and revelation of God would make you wise to God and want to share still. Because people today, even if people want to get something out of the world and they're going to die for some reason, they leave a record of it in some way that you can find it. These people way back then never left anything to let you know Christ, the living Son of God, showed up to us. Why? Because he never showed up in those ancient times. His ancient appearances were limited to biblical times in biblical lands, because this is just a biblical myth. Like other religions have their holy books with their religious myths. Thank you for listening. Again, find me and more of the teachings of this New Testament is Fake series on the Yalak Emet channel on YouTube.com. Find me as well on Patreon and Twitter. I'll see you in the next lesson in this series, sent from God to help you to decide about Jesus.